Hi everybody, Chris at Torque King here. We're going to do a little bit of a different video today. Picked up a transmission off Facebook Marketplace, and basically I'll give you an idea of what you got if you're doing the same, picking something up from an individual or a shop that you don't exactly know what's going on. The gentleman I got this from said that everything worked. He just switched to a newer 6-speed transmission. He said, but the third gear was a little bit chunky. So I'm going to go through this, drain the oil, take a few things apart. We'll get into the third gear and see what we can find out. Maybe it's something simple, maybe it's something atrocious. Can't really tell from turning the gears over, which I've already done off camera, but we'll see when we get into it. Okay, so bottom bolt in your transfer case, or transmission PTO cover rather, is going to be the easiest place to drain all your oil. So I'm going to drain it here, try not to make a big mess. I don't know if the gentleman that I bought it from had drained it or not. About to find out. But one of the first things you can learn from is your oil. And we've got some in there. And that actually looks really clean. So we're not seeing a whole lot of fluid come out. That's okay. One of the easiest places to inspect a transmission, though, is right here at the PTO cover. As you're taking yours apart, hang on to this tag right there, because that's got information on the original build and what kind of parts are in it. We use a medium to small swing press here and get this loose from the case. Alright, so the first thing we see, this has still got the magnet in there. A lot of these came originally with a magnet in there, but if somebody's been in it, cleaned it up, some people get rid of those. I have no idea why. It's a good idea to have it, because as you saw in there, there's a little bit of fine particulate matter, and it's better that the magnet catch that than have it to keep going through your bearings and in between where it doesn't belong. So right now I'm draining some more oil out of the transmission just to make this as clean a job as possible while I move it around on the table. Now, this transmission like this weighs about 200 pounds. I'm not sure exactly the weight, but if you feel uncomfortable holding that much weight, get some help.
Stop it. Get some help.
Probably got a buddy that needs a beer. So once I get this drained out pretty good, I'm going to take off the tail shaft housing and the bell housing, maybe in the reverse order, but I'm going to make the whole transmission a little bit easier to grab onto and start getting into the parts that we're inspecting. Okay, so those are 9/16 head bolts, and if you end up losing some of those bolts, we've got those bolts. As a matter of fact, we've got every bolt on this transmission. If you need something like that, these are 3/4 inch bolts, 3/4 inch head on the bolt. And this bell housing on the Dodge has a different pattern than the same transmission on a Chevy. NV4500 is used on the Chevrolets as well. The early transmissions have a different bolt pattern between the tranny and the bell housing than this later style Dodge. Well, all the Dodges have the same style. The later style Chevy has the same housing pattern for these bolts. So that should just pop right off there. We'll worry about an inspection on that a little bit later. For right now, stay concentrated on the transmission. Next thing I'll pull off is the tail housing. This mess here is entirely unnecessary. This transmission is completely sealed when it's mated with its original style transfer case. This seal right here mates to the input gear on a transfer case and should not leak. You don't need to put that silicone in there. If it just makes you feel better, maybe just don't use that much. Now, these bolts on the case here are 10 millimeter 12-point socket. And they're only put in there at about 28 foot-pounds if they're done right, but they can be really sticky because they're also sealed with silicone at the same time. There is no gasket that goes between the tail housing and the transfer case besides silicone. Hang on to those bolts though. They are a particular style and they're not easy to find, but if you do lose them, we've got them here as well. Now this is why you want to make sure that you've got as much oil drained out of the transmission as you can before you take this part off. Because when I take this loose, I'm going to have some leakage here. I'm going to put a couple towels down. All right. There are some dowel pins that locate this tail housing to keep it concentric with the rest of the transmission. There's one right here, and there's one right here. When you're rebuilding yours, or just working on it, make sure that you've got both those dowel pins. That's another part that we have here, but it's absolutely critical. You need to have that part. Right here is our countershaft 5th gear. And from initial inspection, everything there looks pretty good. Here's our 5th gear nut. Somebody's been in there. We can have a look closer. Right here, we can see where somebody took a chisel and they staked that nut down into the groove there. You can see this slight amount of silicone around the perimeter where the tail shaft housing was. That's just about how much you want. Just enough to make sure that you're sealed up, but not making a mess. It's a good idea to make sure you know where each of these parts that are on those bolts go to. Take a picture, have it for a reference. It's just a good idea all around. These are a 13 millimeter bolt, 13 millimeter head. And as I take them off, I'm setting them aside. It's a good idea, especially if you're going to just be into a transmission briefly, to go ahead and clean around these bolt heads before you take the bolts out. That way, if you're going to put it right back together, you don't get any debris into the transmission. I'm not so worried about it on this particular one because I'm going to go through this one completely. But think about what you're doing before you do it. Got one little barb being a little bit stubborn right there. So somebody's messed around with that. Maybe it just got bent while it was being installed or uninstalled. All right, last bolt on the top cover. This top cover, like the rear tail housing, is only sealed off with RTV silicone. Also like the rear, it has a dowel pin here and another one over here. And that last bolt you saw me get loose. It does have a provision on either side to crack it loose. And these 3 spots. And you can see I hadn't had it open before, but that's all it took. And we're open to the rest of the transmission. So we look at the top cover here, and we've got our shift forks. That's our 3/4 shift fork at the front, our 1/2 shift fork there, and our 5 in reverse fork. The only one with pads is that 5 in reverse fork, and it's got a plastic pad there, some sort of nylon, whatever it is. That's made to handle the wear and tear in there. The rest of this shift cover looks really good. I don't see an excessive amount of galling or scoring on my shift forks. They all look pretty good. And when I shifted the transmission on the bench, like I said off camera, everything moved pretty smoothly. So I'm going to leave that nice and clean out of our way. Okay, so we're into the transmission here, and we've got our 3/4 shift collar, our 1/2 shift collar, and our 5 reverse collar here. This first collar is going to be where we're expecting to look for a problem with our third gear. If I go forward, that would be like you shifting back into 4th gear. The pawl inside will shift that forward to 4th gear. 4th gear is direct. So 1-to-1 ratio between input and output. They're going the same speed. That's what I've got going with that right there. We're in 4th gear. Now if I shift it back into 3rd gear, then the output shaft is going to be turning slightly slower. What I'm looking for here though is 3rd gear. This is 3rd gear right here, is what they said was kind of chunky. And I can see a definite wear pattern on there where it's polished on the teeth. So what I'm not seeing is any problem with that part of 3rd gear. I don't see any broken teeth or scrapes or anything like that. I don't see any uneven, unusual wear. So we'll go and look at 1st and 2nd gear. I'll shift that back into neutral. All of these gears will sit perfectly still while the rest of that main shaft turns. I haven't seen anybody else show that, but it's kind of nice to know those gears can turn independently. Now I can't turn them independently of each other here because they're connected to the gears on the counter shaft. The counter shaft turns when the input shaft turns it, and so it's going to move these gears all the time. Everything in here when this is turning is throwing oil all over the place. You're getting lubrication everywhere. And an interesting note, that's what works really well with our filter or cooler system. We can put a filter here on the side, but the coolers can come with a filter, and when the transmission is throwing oil all over, it's a passive filter. You don't pump through it, but the warm fluid, which you warm up in about 5 minutes of driving, will push all of that fluid through that filter and keep the interior of your transmission safer quite a bit longer. So, good idea. We'll link that in the description as well. So moving on, 1st gear is our largest gear right there because it's our lowest gear. Put it into 1st gear and everything's looking good there. I can roll it over, and that's my lowest reduction to my output shaft. And watching this gear come around, I don't see any unusual wear on the 1st gear either. I don't have to be shifted into gear to look at all of these gears. So I'm looking at 2nd gear right here now. And again, we can see it definitely has the wear pattern of about a 300,000 mile transmission, but nothing looks bad. No pieces of the gear missing. Now, I wasn't yet looking at the clutch collars on there for the synchros, but everything that I'm looking at for 2nd gear looks good. All my clutch hub parts are nice and pointed the way they're supposed to be. The synchro, at least from what I can see while it's still installed, looks the same way. Let's look at the next gear. We can see a little bit in there, but you kind of have to get everything out to completely check it out. What I'm seeing so far looks pretty good. We'll move on to the next step. The input shaft and front bearing retainer. So the customer told me this one already had the upgraded 1 3/8 shaft. The 1 3/8 shaft is the same shaft that they use for the NV5600 and the G56. They're not the same part, but it's the same size. So you can get a heavier duty clutch for that larger input size. You can get plenty of heavy duty clutches that work just fine with the original stock 1¼ inch shaft as well. But I'm guessing the reason he went this route is because he was going to go to a 6-speed later. So before he could afford the 6-speed, and he was just putting the clutch in, he put in the clutch with that larger input. Okay, we don't want to damage this part when we take it off. It's a little dirty and a little messy, but I don't want to ding it up. So I'm going to use a small hammer to just crack it loose. Because it's also sealed to the case with some silicone. And I've got it pretty well cracked loose. Now I've got to free of the silicone and it should come off. This was maybe a little too much silicone, so I can tell by the way this is put on that they were definitely into this, but we've already covered that. It's not the stock part. It's the upgraded version. You only want to make up that thousandths gap with a thin film. You don't need very much. So I'm just working this in a little bit at a time. There we go. Now, the bearing race in there, that all looks like it's in really good shape. And it looks like the seal was replaced new in there, which it should be anyway. Now this part lifts out very easily. Now let's see. I'm going to lift that a little bit. I'm going to tip the transmission. There. Just that little bit of extra help got it out. Looks like everything inside that shaft is good. I don't see any wear patterns in that. So once we've gotten in this far, we can get to our 4th gear clutch hub and synchro. You can see that everything is looking pretty good. But to get any deeper into this, we're going to have to go ahead and take our 5th gear nut off. That's the tool that is absolutely necessary. If you don't get anything else to tear into this that's a specialized tool, the one you definitely need is the 5th gear nut tool. These roll pins that hold this 5th gear shift fork are a mushroom head pin, and so you got to have a good file to get there, a good tool to get that out of there. I should be using a roll pin punch. I just don't have one with me today. So this regular flat punch will work. There you go. One punch to remove another punch. All right, we're done with that part. Now, if we slip this off without taking the 5th gear hub, clutch hub there, then that'll throw my synchro, or my synchro struts will fly off. We don't want to have that. I'll show you what those are in just a moment. All right, that's our 5th gear snap ring for the clutch hub. Now that part should just come out. There we go. So we can see our clutch material in here on the synchro. Doesn't look burned or worn to me. And the 5th gear hub itself also looks good. We'll set that aside. Right here, when I'm pushing on them, they grab together, which is what you want that to do. You don't want it to lock together. But you want it to be able to spin smoothly, and then when you put pressure on, they grab. Now we'll try and slip 5th gear part way off. Yeah, I can't get it past the 5th gear on the main shaft. So as much as I didn't want to, the 5th gear collar is coming off. Here, let's have a look down here. These struts that we see right here are what's gonna fly loose when I pop this off. So we want to make sure that we have some way to retain those, somewhere to keep them. I'm going to get a small screwdriver and I'll wiggle those into a little better position before I take this the rest of the way off. There, they fell anyways. 2 struts, 2 springs, and 1 stayed in place. There we go. Go ahead and put that back in there. Now the reason I went ahead and took the shift fork off instead of just leaving it all together is to get this nut off. We're going to have to get pretty western with it. But basically we've got that staked in spot on our 5th gear nut, and I'm going to get a chisel underneath it and lift that back up a little bit so that when I put my tool on there I can spin that nut off. Alright, so I'm going to put this into 2 gears at one time, and that effectively locks that shaft into place. So now when I turn on that, it's not going to go anywhere. I still need to get that nut loose. I still need to raise that a little bit. So all I found so far was a nice little punch. But since I'm just trying to lift it, it should work. So you might wonder, if it's so easy to lift that little nub out of there, did it do any good at all? I'd say yes, it did. Number one, it didn't go anywhere that I could tell. But also, it doesn't take very much to hold something in place. It takes a whole lot more to break over that first initial loosening point before everything starts to go. So we're about ready to swing on this. Get my tool on there. And this has been beat on pretty badly already. But it'll be loud. This tool can work with either a ratchet, or you can swing on it just like I did there. That came loose pretty easy too. I don't think they were all the way up to that 300 foot-pounds that we recommend in our book. If you want to know how to go through this whole transmission, we've got the TM1003, which is the manual that was done in-house on the NV4500. It's got a lot of great information. Okay, now it looks like we're dealing with a stock shaft. You see that rust in there? It's a good thing I pulled this apart. I got a whole lot of rust in there. That's unusual. Part way into reverse and part way into 1st gear. Maybe I won't get that one out. There, that's good enough. All right, now I can take my 5th gear off the back here, and there's a bearing in there. That looks good. And the thrust washer, that also looks good. There's also right here, have a look in there, there's an anti-rotation pin. That little pin right there, and these are the wrong pliers for it, but it doesn't take much to get it out. That little pin right there keeps that thrust washer from spinning independently on the shaft to reduce wear. So we'll take these plates off. I think I'll just take my main shaft plate. All right, here we have our shims. When you're putting the transmission together, you'll have the input shaft in, you'll have everything put into place, and this shim stock holds this bearing right there snug into the right spot to keep your fore and aft play within spec. You want 2 to 6 thousandths front to back play, and you take out the difference with those shims. We also have shim packs in place that you can buy here. The main shaft shim is, I believe it's a QU10009, and the counter shaft also uses shims, and that's a QU10008 shim pack for that. Okay, so we've got everything loose here. I'll go ahead and take this bearing cup out. And even with that rust all in that 5th gear there, that cup looks pretty good. There's a little bit of, that was just from sitting and resting. I bet I can wipe that out and it'll be nice and clean. But it's not, oh there I see a little bit of galling and pitting. It'll be good to put new bearings in here. I'll set that aside. All right, now we're going to try and take our main shaft out. I pulled that out. That's what the bearing race that the shims line up against. Then the bearing at the back of the main shaft here, this one just slid right off. They're not supposed to slide off, should be pressed on. But if you get the book, the TM1003, you can read like I did that several aftermarket shafts that have tried to fix the 5th gear nut problem have a slip fit bearing, and the whole reason for that is so that you can get this shaft in and out and work on it more than once. So now with that bearing out of the way, I can lift this past the counter shaft and get my whole main shaft out. Whew, that is not light. So let's look down inside the transmission case. It looks like my counter shaft gears, my reverse gear there, and that also runs my 1st gear. And there's my 2nd gear and 3rd gear. And that's just the counter shaft main gear. Everything in there looks really good. I can see a little wear on that right there. But that might honestly be where the machining stopped. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that's where the machining stopped in the final polish on that gear. But it rolls over beautiful. So a fresh set of bearings and some new synchros in here, I think we'll have a good transmission. There's our 4th gear synchro. And our friction material looks good. Our clutch hub looks good. We want to look for wear. Oh no, looks like it's a little unevenly worn there. Might need to replace that. If you look close, that should look more like a symmetrical house. And it's not. It's worn more on one side than the other. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not sure. I'll consult the book. It's a good book. So we could take this part even further, but that's basically what we're going for today, is just an initial teardown to look at everything. Our link is in the description below, and while you're looking there, give us a like and a comment. It really does help us reach more people just like you. Then subscribe to see more of our product highlights. We've been around for over 30 years and plan to be around at least that much longer. Thanks for watching, and good luck keeping your rig on the road.